I don't know if you've ever truly thought about what it means for you to fear God, that you would get in His Word and abide in His presence, not because you're trying to check a box, but because there's a healthy fear that if you don't, you might actually start living your life without Him somehow. Jeremiah's prophecy told him things that, it was going to be 70 years in captivity. And so Daniel, he took God at His word. Daniel went and prayed 3 times a day, every day, same spot, got on his knees and knelt before God. There was just this consistency. He abided in God's presence. He knew God's word, and he trusted God's authority. He had seen it over and over and over again, and he knew this would be no different. He hears of the law that these men pass. You don't see him freak out. You don't see him run to the king. You don't see him try to orchestrate the situation. He just goes and does what he's always done. He chose to walk in faith and belief rather than in doubt and in self-protection. Somebody needs to hear that today. You're in a circumstance or a situation and you're uncertain. You think that the things around you are changing so fast, and you think you've got to do something in order to play this game and to be in just the right place at just the right time. And I'm here to tell you, your God has never changed. He is never out of control. He's always in control. And you can take a lesson from Daniel this morning. All you've got to do is consistently do what you've already been doing. Get on your knees, tell the Lord He's in authority and He's in control, and trust Him with your life. And here's the deal. That concept is based in something that our culture, especially our church culture, our religious people, our Bible thumpers, all of us, frankly, have forgotten, and that's this. Daniel had a healthy fear of the Lord. He feared God. It made me think of a story in Acts chapter 5. The apostles were basically experiencing some resistance, and there were some Sadducees that were jealous. They were frustrated and jealous about these, followers of Christ and what they were doing. And they kept preaching the name of Jesus, and so they would get arrested and they would throw them into the jail. And suddenly in Acts chapter 5, an angel of the Lord comes and just releases them from jail. And so they get out of jail and they go right back to preaching the word. And so the guard goes and he arrests them again. And the high counselor looks at him and he's like, hey, listen, I think I was really clear when I told you never speak of or teach in Jesus' name again. And Peter's response, oh my gosh, in Acts 5, go read it this week. He didn't say, yeah, you know what, you're right. We forgot. You said that the first time to get out of the situation and then go do what he wanted to do. No. He didn't just sit there quietly. He didn't say, hey, we're not really hurting anybody. Can't we just get along here? No, Peter looked right back at him and he said, no, we must fear God rather than man. Proverbs chapter 9. Verse 10 says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. This right here is the posture that we are after as followers of Jesus. We're not combative, but we are confident in who God is. Because confidence is rooted in a fear of God, a true understanding of who He is, His holiness, that He is set apart, He's other. His place in history versus my place in history. His authority, His beauty, His glory, His splendor, His power versus mine, His abilities. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Daniel had this exact same heart hundreds of years before. Same attitude toward God. There was nobody that was going to stand in his way of worshiping his God because he knew that his God was the one, the authoritative, true God. He was stronger. There was this moment when we were raising our kids. Chloe, our oldest, when she was super young, she would get fired up. She gets that from her dad. She would just get fired up, and she'd be kind of all over the house, and I'd be like, hey, you need to calm down. You need to bring it back. And she'd be all over the place. And finally, I'd kind of get her on the couch, and we'd start wrestling, and she'd start fighting back. And I realized at a really young age that this little girl was really, really strong. So much so that she was strategic, and she'd kind of pop me in the right spots and elbows would go flying. And I would finally, as a dad, I would have to grab her with both of my arms and just hold her to get her to settle down and say, Chloe, who's stronger? She'd go, I am. And she'd start kicking. She'd start kicking with everything she's got. I am. And I would just kind of like a vice. I'd begin to just squeeze a little tighter. Who's stronger, Chloe? Me. Finally, when her arms and her legs and everything was just so still, I'd say, Chloe, who's stronger? And you'd finally feel the tension release in her body. She'd say, you are, Dad. And then I'd let her go. And it was, as I was studying this, I was like, this is really an understanding about the fear of the Lord. You know, we all have that. It could be an older sibling. It could be a parent. It could be an aunt. It could be an uncle. It could be a coach. But you know, it's that mental edge that person over us has. There's always like this healthy fear. This is what Daniel had with his God. It's what I want you to understand today. That strong faith begins with healthy fear. Strong faith begins with a healthy fear. Why fear? I mean, why that word? How do I even build a healthy fear? Well, it really comes when you understand and experience different character traits about God throughout your lifetime. Specifically, the one that we're talking about today and the one that Daniel was familiar with was God's faithfulness. God's steadfastness, his constancy. He always delivered. He always came through on his promises. Daniel knew it. These are characteristics of God, and characteristics that Daniel knew even in his own life. He was unequipped and incapable of fulfilling, but God was always faithful. Daniel's fear of the Lord led Daniel in his situation where a threat is imminent to do what he had always done, because he knew there was nothing man could ultimately do to him. What did verse 10 tell us about Daniel? It says that he went home, he knelt down as usual, just as he had always done. Dwight L. Moody said, most of the world begins the day looking toward the world and hoping to get something from it. But the Christian believer looks to the Lord and his promises, and he enters each new day by faith. Our outlook determines our outcome, he says. And when we look to the Lord for his guidance and we look for his help, we know that our outcome is in his hands. He says, real true faith is man's weakness leaning on God's strength. Better yet, man's weakness transformed into God's strength. Another author said, a believer who knows how to kneel in prayer has no problem standing in the strength of the Lord. I don't know how that hits you today. I don't know if you've ever truly thought about what it means for you to fear God, that you would get in his word and abide in his presence, not because you're trying to check a box, but because there's a healthy fear that if you don't, you might actually start living your life without him somehow. Do you see the difference? God has invited you into a meaningful relationship. That's our mission here at Connection Church. We want to be a part of that invitation. But you got to do your part. And it begins with a healthy fear of the Lord. That's why I confess my sin, because I recognize that God judges sin. He's faithful to judge it. He's always consistent in it because he's a God of justice. That's part of who he is. So my fear of that leads me to say, I don't want to continue in my sin. Are you tracking with me today? Yeah, Matt, but here's the deal. Daniel's faithfulness to God gets him thrown into a lion's den. Because once he prays to God, the rest of the story tells us that he basically obliterates this law that the king decreed. And the king is nervous because he loves Daniel, but the law can't be revoked. And so he takes Daniel and he has him thrown into the lion's den. The entire evening, the king is troubled by what just happened. He sees what happened and what these men did, but he has to follow through with what he says. And so what happens? He can't sleep. He eventually, the next morning, wakes up early. He runs to the lion's den, and it had a stone rolled over it. He pulls the stone. He's like, Daniel, are you in there? Daniel's like, yeah. Hey, man, listen, God sent an angel to shut the mouths of the lions and I'm completely unharmed. So God's faithfulness again in Daniel's life. And the king makes a declaration at the end of the chapter. You don't have to look at it. It's in verses 26 and 27. But he says, I decree throughout my kingdom, everyone should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel. Hold on. Why is he bringing this concept back? Why would he say be scared of him? Because he recognizes the authority and the power that the king that God has, even over the kings of this world. More on that next week. He says, for he is the living God. He will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed. His rule will never end. He rescues and saves his people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. And so Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. What I didn't tell you about the story is the guys that schemed the plan, the king takes them, their spouses, and all of their children and tosses them to the lions who didn't happen to eat the day before. It says before they hit the ground, the lions took them out. So, similar to the other stories we've seen in this book, we've seen captivity, we've seen fiery furnace, and now this, remember, God allows these situations all to happen for one purpose alone. It's his glory. It's so that a king and that a nation would turn to him. He is the king. And you see that happen a couple of times through different kings of Babylon and now Darius and Cyrus the Persian. Daniel's night in the lion's den reveals something about Daniel, yes, but more importantly, it revealed and ended in the glory of God, which is what it's always been about and it's always going to be about. My question for us this morning is, what school of faith are you from? Not where were you raised, but like where are you right now in your faith journey? For Daniel and his friends, it was this: our God is able to deliver us, but even if he doesn't, he is still God. That's the school of faith. You saw it with Daniel, you saw it with his friends, and now you see it with Daniel again. Here's the question: how much do you trust your God? That's the real question today. If a lion's den, figuratively speaking, was in your future, what would you do? Take your circumstances right now. Take your situation, put them on the table. Do I trust God? What are you currently worried about? What do you have trouble releasing that just keeps you awake at night? What do you know about God that you could lean on and rely on during these times right now, rather than allowing those situations in your life to overtake your thoughts? Here's what Daniel knew. God had always been faithful. And that's really the principle that you and I need to learn to rest on often. God is faithful always.